You ever watch a grown adult block a school bus full of kids and think they actually believe they're the authority? The first thing I remember is the smell. Sharp, chemical, like burnt plastic mixed with something metallic. Hanging in the air before the sirens even reached us, low at first, then rising, layering over the distant hum of engines and the restless chatter of kids trapped behind tinted bus windows. I was halfway down my driveway, boots crunching against gravel that felt louder than it should have, when I saw the line of yellow buses stacked nose to tail at the front gate of our neighborhood. Hazard. Lights blinking in nervous rhythm, drivers leaning out their windows, arms waving, and right there in the middle of it all stood Margaret Hale. Perfectly pressed blouse, phone in one hand, the other planted on her hip like she was posing for a magazine spread about suburban control, and she was shaking her head, slow, deliberate, while pointing at the metal gate like it was sacred ground. I picked up the pace, the air feeling heavier with every step, and as I got closer I could hear her voice, cutting through everything else, calm but sharp enough to slice through steel. These buses are not authorized vehicles. You need to reroute. Like we weren't standing under an active evacuation alert that had just lit up every phone in a 5-mile radius. One of the drivers shouted back, something about emergency protocol, about kids needing to get out now, and I caught a glimpse through the nearest window, small hands pressed against the glass, faces tight with confusion more than fear. The kind of silence kids fall into when adults start arguing about things they don't understand but know are wrong. My chest tightened when I realized one of those buses carried my daughter, Lily, and for a second everything narrowed. The noise, the movement, the whole scene collapsing into that single thought like a vice. Margaret didn't even flinch when I stepped up beside the gate, didn't look surprised, just gave me that same thin smile I'd seen a dozen times before when she handed out violation notices like party favors, the kind that never reached her eyes. "Daniel, this doesn't concern you," she said, like I wasn't standing there breathing the same toxic air, like the flashing lights behind us were just decoration. I told her to open the gate, kept my voice level, controlled, the way you do when you're trying not to escalate something already spiraling. But she tapped her phone screen, probably pulling up bylaws she'd memorized like scripture, and said, "HOA regulations are very clear. No unregistered commercial vehicles beyond this point." And for a moment, the absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Almost. Because behind her, the gate she was guarding so fiercely was just steel and hinges. But to her it was power, and power, once someone tastes it, has a way of blinding everything else. A police cruiser rolled up then, lights cutting through the haze, officers stepping out, scanning the scene, and I saw it in their faces immediately. That hesitation, that uncertainty that comes when rules start overlapping in ways no one wants to take responsibility for. One of them asked Margaret to cooperate, mentioned evacuation orders, but she doubled down, voice louder now. "This is private property, officer, and I am the acting authority here." And the words hung there, heavy, wrong, like something out of place that no one had corrected yet. The buses idled, engines rumbling like a warning, the air growing thicker, kids still waiting, and I stood there, tasting that metallic edge at the back of my throat, realizing this wasn't just about a gate anymore. It was about someone deciding that paperwork mattered more than people. And as Margaret turned her back to me to argue with the officers, I felt something shift, quiet but absolute, like a line being crossed that couldn't be uncrossed, and I pulled out my phone, already knowing the next move, already hearing the clock ticking down even if no one else seemed to notice it yet. I have spent most of my adult life around systems that either hold under pressure or fail when it matters most, and standing there watching that gate stay closed while those buses idled, I knew exactly which kind this situation was becoming. My name is Daniel Brooks, 38 years old, civil engineer by trade, National Guard, officer by commitment, and for the past 6 years I have been the guy cities call when infrastructure starts to turn into a problem instead of a solution, which means I have seen bridges buckle, levees strain, and evacuation routes collapse under bad decisions made by people who thought they understood control better than they actually did. What most people in this neighborhood saw when they looked at me was just another homeowner with a pickup truck and a garage full of tools, the guy who kept his lawn within regulation height and nodded politely at HOA meetings without ever volunteering for anything. And I let them believe that because it kept things simple, because explaining the other part of my life never felt necessary until moments like this one. The phone felt cold in my hand as I scrolled past missed alerts and warning notifications, each one repeating the same message about hazardous air conditions moving faster than expected, advisory zones expanding, evacuation strongly recommended. And I could hear Lily's voice in my head from that morning asking if I would be home early, asking if I could pick her up instead of the bus. And I had told her everything would be fine because that is what you say when there is no reason to believe otherwise. One of the bus drivers leaned out again, his voice cracking this time, asking if anyone was going to take responsibility for what was happening. And the officer closest to Margaret shifted his weight like he wanted to step in, but did not want to cross a line he could not clearly define. And that hesitation, that tiny pause, was all it took for Margaret to double down, to raise her voice just enough to sound official, just enough to make it seem like she had the authority she was claiming. "We follow procedure here," she said, and I could hear the pride in it, like procedure was something she owned instead of something designed to protect people. I stepped back from the gate then, not because I was giving up, but because I recognized the pattern, the same one I had seen in field operations where arguing with the wrong person only burned time you did not have, and time was the one thing tightening around all of us like a vice, the kind you do not notice until it is already too late. I unlocked my phone fully and opened a contact I did not use often, one I had saved without a name attached, just a number that meant something different depending on the situation, and for a second I watched my own reflection in the dark screen, dust on my face, tension in my jaw, the weight of everything settling into place, and then I made the call, stepping far enough away that the noise of the buses and Margaret's voice faded into the background, leaving only the distant sirens and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. When the line connected, I did not waste words, did not explain more than necessary. I gave coordinates, described the obstruction, confirmed the evacuation order, and there was a pause on the other end, brief but heavy, followed by a single acknowledgement that told me everything I needed to know. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, turning just in time to see Margaret glance in my direction with that same dismissive expression, like nothing had changed, like she still held the center of this situation in the palm of her hand. And I let her believe that for a few seconds longer, because sometimes the most important part of taking control is knowing exactly when to reveal it. And as I walked back toward the line of buses, the engines still rumbling, the air still thick, I could feel the shift coming, quiet but inevitable, like pressure building behind a structure that was never designed to hold it. The longer Margaret kept talking, the more the situation started to fracture around her in ways she either could not see or refused to acknowledge. Because behind that gate the air had shifted from tense to restless, the kind of uneasy movement that spreads when people realize they are being held in place without a good reason, and I could see it in the way the bus drivers exchanged looks, in the way one of them shut off his engine only to start it again seconds later like his instincts were, fighting against instructions he knew were wrong. I walked along the side of the first bus, close enough to see inside clearly now, and that was when I spotted Lily, third row back on the right, her forehead pressed lightly against the glass, eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on me. And in that moment, everything else dropped out, the noise, the arguments, even the smell that still lingered in the air, because she gave me a small nod, not scared, just waiting, trusting that I would figure this out the way I always had. And that trust settled into me heavier than anything Margaret could say. I lifted a hand just enough for her to see, a simple gesture, a promise without words, then stepped back as the driver leaned toward me through the open window, asking in a low voice if there was any way out of this because the route behind them was already flagged as compromised, meaning turning around was not an option anymore. And I told him to hold position, keep the kids calm, keep the doors closed, because the last thing we needed was panic spreading faster than the problem itself. Behind me, Margaret was still holding her ground, now arguing with the second officer who was clearly losing patience but still tethered to uncertainty, and I caught fragments of her words about liability, about unauthorized access, about how letting those buses through could expose the HOA to legal risk, and that was when it hit me just how far removed her priorities were from reality. Because she was talking about paperwork while the clock was ticking on something far more immediate. A gust of wind cut through the street then, carrying that sharp chemical edge. Stronger than before, Enough to make a few people cough, enough to make the drivers glance toward the horizon where a faint haze was starting to build. And for the first time I saw a crack in Margaret's composure. Just a flicker, a hesitation that passed as quickly as it came, but told me everything I needed to know. She felt it too. She just was not ready to admit it. I checked my watch out of habit, counting silently, knowing roughly how long it would take for a response once the call had been made, and every second stretched longer than it should have. The kind of slow burn that makes people start to second-guess their decisions. And I could see that ripple starting now as a few parents who had gathered nearby began raising their voices, asking why the buses were still sitting there, asking who was in charge, and Margaret tried to answer them with the same controlled tone, but it was slipping, thinning at the edges as reality pushed back harder than her authority could hold. One of the officers finally stepped closer to the gate controls, clearly weighing whether to override her, and she moved quickly to block him, not aggressively, but with enough presence to make it clear she was not backing down. And that was the moment the situation locked into place. The final piece clicking where there was no longer any gray area left, just a wrong decision being defended past the point of reason. I exhaled slowly, steady, feeling that familiar calm settle and that only comes when a plan is already in motion and all that is left is execution. And as I looked down the road beyond the buses, past the curve where the neighborhood opened toward the main access route, I listened for something most people there would not recognize right away, a distant low-frequency vibration that was not part of the chaos in front of us, something deeper, more structured. And when it finally reached me, faint but unmistakable, I knew the shift I had been waiting for was no longer coming. It was already on its way. The sound reached everyone else a few seconds after it reached me, low at first, like distant thunder rolling across pavement instead of sky, and heads started turning down the main road where the curve hid whatever was coming. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence as that steady mechanical rhythm grew louder, more defined, layered with the unmistakable cadence of multiple engines moving in sync. Margaret paused in the middle of a sentence, her phone still raised like a badge of authority, and, for the first time since this started, she did not have words ready, just a slight narrowing of her eyes as she tried to place the sound into a category she could control. But this was not something that fit inside her rulebook. I did not move, did not step forward or back, just stood there with my hands relaxed at my sides, watching the road as the first vehicle came into view, dark. Green, squared edges, lights cutting through the haze in a way that felt deliberate rather than urgent, followed by another, and another, a convoy forming out of the bend like a line drawn with purpose instead of panic. The officers straightened almost immediately, posture shifting in that subtle way trained professionals do when they recognize a higher level of response entering the scene. And one of them reached for his radio, speaking quickly, tone different now, sharper, more aligned with something bigger than neighborhood disputes. Margaret turned toward me then, just slightly, like she was trying to read something in my expression that had not been there before, but all she saw was the same calm she had dismissed earlier, the same stillness that now felt less like compliance and more like certainty. The lead vehicle slowed as it approached the gate, tires crunching against asphalt, and the rumble settled into a controlled idle that vibrated through the ground beneath our feet. A presence that did not need to announce itself loudly because it was already understood. Doors opened with measured precision, boots hitting pavement in a rhythm that matched the engines, and uniforms stepped into view. Clean lines, clear insignia, the kind that do not ask for permission because they operate under it. A man approached the officers first, exchanging quick words that shifted their stance even further, and then his gaze moved to the gate, to the buses, to Margaret, taking in the entire situation in seconds, the way people do when they are trained to assess rather than react. Margaret found her voice again, stepping forward, lifting her phone as if documentation could anchor her authority. "This is private property," she said, louder now, pushing against the growing weight around her. "You cannot just enter without approval." And for a brief moment the words hung there, fragile against the structure that had just arrived. I stepped forward then, not fast, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance between where I had been standing and the space that now mattered. And as I did, the man in uniform turned toward me, recognition passing between us without introduction. A small nod that said everything had already been communicated before any of this became visible. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and glanced at the screen for a second before looking back up, aligning myself with the moment that had been building since the call. And when I spoke, my voice carried just enough to cut through what remained of the confusion. Steady, clear. "This area is under evacuation protocol," I said, meeting the officer's eyes, then shifting briefly toward Margaret. "And it is no longer under her control." And the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of realization, the kind that settles slowly but changes everything once it lands. Margaret's smile did not disappear all at once. It cracked slowly, like something under pressure that had been pretending to hold much longer than it should have. And she glanced between me and the uniformed officer as if trying to recalibrate the situation into something she could still control. But control does not survive clarity, and that was exactly what had just arrived. The officer beside me gave a short, confirming nod, then stepped forward with a presence that did not raise its voice, but did not need to. "Ma'am, this area is now classified under emergency evacuation authority," he said, tone measured, final, and the words landed differently than anything she had heard before because they did not ask for compliance. They assumed it. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, lifting her phone again as if the device itself could shield her position. "You cannot override private property governance without," she started, but the sentence did not finish the way she expected because the officer simply raised a hand, not aggressively, just enough to pause her. "Ma'am, you are currently interfering with an active evacuation route," he continued, each word placed carefully, like stepping stones across a line she had already crossed without realizing it. Behind us, the engines of the buses shifted, drivers straightening in their seats, the subtle change of anticipation moving through the line like a current. And I turned just enough to catch Lily's eyes again, her posture. Different now, less tense, like she could feel the shift even without understanding the details. The gate stood between us still, a simple mechanical barrier that had carried far more weight than it was ever designed to hold. And one of the uniformed personnel moved toward the control panel without hesitation, gloved hand hovering for only a second before pressing the override. And the sound that followed was almost quiet compared to everything else. A low metallic click followed by the slow release of tension as the mechanism disengaged. Margaret stepped forward instinctively, reaching out as if she could stop it with proximity alone. "You cannot do that," she said again. But the conviction was gone now, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, because the reality in front of her no longer matched the authority she believed she had. The gate began to slide open, inch by inch, the steel panels separating with a drawn-out scrape that seemed louder than it should have been, like the sound itself carried meaning, like it was undoing more than just a physical barrier. And the first bus driver leaned forward, hands tightening on the wheel, waiting for the signal that had been delayed far too long. The officer gave a simple motion, 2 fingers forward, and that was all it took. The first bus rolling ahead slowly, carefully, tires crossing the threshold that had been denied just minutes before, followed by the second, then the third, each one moving with increasing confidence as the path cleared. The air shifted again as the convoy of buses began to move past us. Engines steady, the line that had been trapped now flowing the way it was always meant to. And I stood there watching them pass, counting without meaning to 1, 2, 3, until I saw Lily's bus approach. And as it rolled by, she lifted her hand slightly, a small wave that carried more relief than any words could. And I returned it with a nod that said everything was under control now. Behind me, Margaret had stepped back, her posture no longer rigid but unsettled, eyes moving quickly between the officers, the vehicles, the open gate, like she was searching for a piece of the situation that still belonged to her. But there was nothing left to hold on to, because authority had shifted completely, cleanly, leaving no space for interpretation. The last bus cleared the gate, and the road beyond filled with movement instead of hesitation. And as the sound of engines carried away down the street, the silence that followed felt different, not empty, but resolved, like something had finally aligned the way it was supposed to. The last bus disappeared around the bend, its taillights fading into the haze that had started this whole chain of events. And for a few seconds nobody spoke, Like the neighborhood itself needed time to catch up to what had just happened. The engine's gone now, replaced by a quieter tension that settled into the empty space they left behind. I could still feel the vibration in the ground from the convoy, a steady reminder that what had just taken place was not a suggestion or a negotiation. It was a transfer of control, clean and undeniable. And as I turned back toward the gate, now fully open, I saw Margaret standing just off to the side, arms no longer crossed, phone lowered, her posture caught somewhere between defiance and disbelief. One of the officers approached her again, this time with a small notepad in hand, asking questions in a tone that had shifted from uncertain to procedural, documenting, clarifying. And I could see the way she responded, words coming faster now, layered with justification, references to bylaws, liability concerns, community standards, all the things that had seemed so solid to her just minutes ago, now sounding thinner against the framework that had replaced them. I stepped back a few feet, giving the scene space, because this part did not need my voice anymore. It needed documentation. It needed the system to do what it was designed to do when someone steps outside their boundaries and refuses to step back. The officer from the convoy moved closer to me, his expression neutral but focused, and we exchanged a few quiet words. Confirmation of the call, acknowledgement of the situation, nothing dramatic, just the kind of concise communication that comes from people who understand that clarity matters more than volume. And when he nodded once, it was enough to close that loop, to confirm that what had been set in motion had reached its intended outcome. Behind us, a few residents had gathered at a distance, watching, whispering, the kind of low conversation that spreads quickly in places like this, where control is usually invisible until it breaks, and I caught fragments of it, confusion, surprise, a shift in perception that was already rewriting the version of events they would carry forward. Margaret tried one more time to reassert something, stepping slightly closer to the officer with the notepad, her voice steadier now, but still missing the foundation it had before. "I was acting within my authority," she said, and the officer paused, pen hovering for a second before writing something down, then looked up and responded in a tone that was calm but absolute. "Ma'am, emergency authority supersedes HOA governance." And that was it. No argument, no escalation, just a statement that closed the door she had been trying to hold open. The wind shifted again, lighter this time, the chemical edge beginning to thin as the evacuation did what it was supposed to do, clearing the area before conditions worsened. And I took a slow breath. The air still not clean, but no longer as sharp, the kind of subtle change you only notice when you are paying attention to more than just the noise. I looked at the gate one more time, now standing open without resistance, just metal and hinges again, stripped of the weight it had carried under the wrong hands. And it struck me how simple it had always been, how quickly something ordinary can become a point of failure when the wrong person decides it represents power instead of purpose. The convoy vehicles remained for a few more minutes, engines idling in that controlled rhythm, a presence that did not linger longer than necessary. And as they began to reposition, preparing to move out once their role was complete, the neighborhood settled into a new kind of quiet, one that felt less controlled and more understood. I slipped my hands into my pockets, shoulders easing for the first time since the sirens had started, and as I watched the officers finish their notes, and Margaret stand there with nothing left to direct, it became clear that what had changed was not just the outcome of a single situation. It was the balance of who actually held authority when it mattered most. And that kind of clarity does not fade easily once it has been seen. The convoy did not leave in a rush. It never does. It pulled back the same way it arrived, controlled, measured, like it had simply corrected something out of place, and was now restoring the balance before disappearing again. And as the last vehicle eased past the open gate, the low rumble faded into the distance, leaving behind a stillness that felt different from the one before, not tense, not uncertain, just quiet in a way that made everything clearer. The officers finished their notes, exchanging a few final words with the National Guard personnel before stepping back into their own roles, and I watched as one of them folded his notepad, glancing once more at Margaret before walking toward his cruiser, the message already delivered without needing repetition. Margaret stood near the edge of the road now, no longer at the center of anything, her phone still in her hand but unused, like she had run out of places to point it, and for the first time since I had known her, she did not seem like someone issuing orders. She looked like someone trying to understand how quickly those orders had stopped matching. A few residents edged closer, careful, curious, the kind of movement people make when they are not sure what they are allowed to say anymore. And I could hear the shift in their tone, quieter, less certain, like the story they had been telling themselves about how things worked here had just been rewritten in real time. I took a slow step forward, not toward Margaret, not toward the officers, just toward the gate itself, running my eyes along the track where it had slid open, the metal still warm from movement, the control panel now just a box on a post instead of a symbol, and it struck me again how something so simple had carried so much weight only minutes ago. Margaret finally looked at me directly, really looked this time, not past me, not through me, but at me, like she was trying to place the version of me she thought she knew against the one standing here now. And there was a question in that look she did not voice, something about how this had happened, how control had shifted so completely without her seeing it coming. I did not say anything at first, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to prove. The situation had already resolved itself in the only way that mattered. But after a second I gave a small nod, not a victory, not a challenge, just acknowledgement, the kind you give when something is finished whether you like the outcome or not. The wind moved through the street again, lighter now, carrying less of that sharp edge, and in the distance the faint outline of the haze was already beginning to thin, the evacuation doing exactly what it was designed to do, removing people from a problem before it could reach them. And I thought about how close it had come to being delayed longer, how a few more minutes of argument could have turned into something much harder to fix. One of the officers walked past me, pausing briefly to say they would be filing a full report, that there would likely be follow-up from the county, his tone professional but firm, and I nodded once, understanding exactly what that meant without needing details. Because systems like this do not just reset, they document, they review, they correct. Margaret turned slightly as if she wanted to respond to that, to push back one more time, but the words did not come. And instead she lowered her phone completely, her shoulders dropping just enough to show that whatever position she thought she held had finally slipped out of her grasp. I slipped my hands back into my pockets, feeling the tension that had built over the last hour slowly unwind, not all at once, but enough to breathe easier, enough to recognize that the moment had passed, and what remained now was the aftermath, the quiet understanding that things would not look the same hereafter. Today, because once people see where real authority comes from, they do not forget it easily. And as I turned away from the gate, leaving it open behind me, I knew that was the part that would last longer than anything else. By the time I reached my driveway, the neighborhood looked the same on the surface, trimmed lawns, identical mailboxes, the quiet order people pay monthly fees to maintain. But something underneath it had shifted in a way that no landscaping rule could cover up. And I could feel it in the way a few neighbors watched me from their porches, not openly staring, just enough to let me know they had seen everything, that whatever version of me they had filed away before did not quite fit anymore. The air had cleared just enough to lose that sharp edge, replaced by the familiar scent of warm asphalt and cut grass. And the absence of urgency made the earlier chaos feel almost unreal, like something that had happened somewhere else until I replayed it in my head. The buses, the gate, Margaret's voice insisting on rules that did not belong in that moment. I set my keys down on the kitchen counter, but did not sit, the habit of staying ready still holding me upright, listening to the quiet, waiting for the next signal even though I knew there would not be one. Not today. About 20 minutes later my phone buzzed, a message from the school district confirming that all buses had cleared the zone and students were being rerouted safely. And a second message followed shortly after from a number I recognized, brief, professional, confirming that the situation had been logged and would move through proper review channels, no drama, no commentary, just the system doing what it is built to do when something crosses into its scope. I stepped back outside, the sun lower now, casting longer shadows across the street, and down near the entrance I could see a small cluster of people still gathered, the kind of informal meeting that forms when something unexpected forces a community to reassess itself. Voices low, gestures measured, like everyone was trying to figure out where the new lines had been drawn. Margaret was there too, standing slightly apart, speaking to one of the officers who remained behind. Her tone controlled again, but stripped of the certainty it carried earlier. and I watched as she nodded at something he said, not agreeing so much as acknowledging. The difference subtle but real. A man from 2 houses down, someone I had only ever exchanged brief greetings with, walked past me and paused, hesitating for a second before saying, "You handled that." Like he was not sure if he should be thanking me or just recognizing what had happened, and I gave a small nod, nothing more, because explaining it would not change what they had already seen. The gate at the end of the street remained open, unmoving now, just a piece of infrastructure again, and I realized that was the detail that would stay with people, not the vehicles or the uniforms, but the fact that something they thought was fixed, controlled, had opened when it needed to, regardless of who stood in front of it. As the evening settled in, lights flickering on one by one in the houses around me, the neighborhood began to return to its routine, but the rhythm was slightly off, like a song played in a different key, familiar but changed, and I leaned against the porch railing, watching the quiet take over, knowing that whatever reports were filed, whatever meetings followed, none of it would fully erase the moment when authority shifted in plain sight and left no room for debate. Margaret eventually walked back toward her house, slower than I had ever seen her move, phone still in hand but no longer raised, and she did not look in my direction as she passed, not out of defiance, but because there was nothing left to challenge, and as I stood there, listening to the distant hum of the city returning to normal, I understood that control is easy to claim when nothing tests it, but the moment it is tested, the truth of it shows up whether you are ready or not. The next morning came quieter than I expected, the kind of calm that settles in after something breaks and resets itself. And when I stepped outside with a cup of coffee in my hand, the air felt clean again. No trace of that chemical edge, just the familiar mix of early sunlight warming pavement and sprinklers ticking in steady rhythm across trimmed lawns, like the neighborhood was trying to remind itself of what normal looked like. The gate at the end of the street was closed again, sitting exactly where it had always been, but it did not feel the same, not after what it had been forced to become the day before, and I found myself watching it for a second longer than usual, remembering the sound it made when it opened. Not loud, not dramatic, just inevitable. A county vehicle rolled in around 9, followed by another, unmarked but official in the way it moved with purpose. And I saw Margaret already standing near the entrance when they arrived, posture straight, dressed the same. As always, like routine could restore what had slipped, but there was a difference now, something quieter in the way she held herself, less certain, more aware of the space around her. I did not walk down there right away. I stayed where I was, leaning against the porch railing, listening to the distant exchange of voices, calm, measured, the kind of conversation that does not escalate because it does not need to. And after a few minutes, one of the officials handed her a document, not forceful, just final. And she took it with both hands, nodding once as she read, the motion small but heavy with understanding. Word travels fast in places like this, faster than any official notice, and by midday neighbors were out more than usual, walking slower, pausing longer, conversations stretching across driveways and sidewalks, all circling the same thing without saying it directly, because they had all seen the moment when something they thought was fixed turned out to be conditional. Lily came home early that afternoon, dropped off by a temporary route that bypassed the main entrance entirely, and when she stepped out of the car, she looked at me with a mix of relief and curiosity, like she had questions but already trusted the answer. And when she asked if everything was okay now, I told her it was, because it was, not because nothing had happened, but because what needed to happen had. Later that evening, I walked down to the gate again, not out of necessity, just out of habit, the gravel crunching under my boots the same way it had the day before, and I ran my hand lightly along the metal frame, feeling nothing but cool steel, no weight, no authority, just material doing what it was designed to do when used correctly. Margaret's house sat quiet, lights on but curtains drawn, and I did not stop there, did not need to, because whatever conversation she had with the county that morning had already drawn the line that mattered. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, I stood there for a moment longer, looking at the road beyond the gate, open, clear, exactly what it should have been all along. And I thought about how easily people confuse control with responsibility, how quickly rules can become obstacles when they are applied without understanding their purpose, and how in the end none of it holds up when something real tests it. I turned back toward my house, the quiet settling in around me again, and as I walked I realized that nothing here had actually changed on the surface. The houses were the same, the streets were the same, even the gate was the same. But the difference was in what people now understood about it, about who decides when it opens and why. And that kind of understanding does not need to be loud to last. It just needs to be true, because real authority does not argue. It shows up, does what it has to do, and leaves everything else to catch up afterward.